The morning my nephew showed up at my door with a real estate agent I had never met, I knew something had shifted in a way I could not name yet. I just did not know how far it had already gone. I have lived in the same house in Kelowna for 38 years. My husband and I bought it the summer our youngest started school, back when this part of British Columbia still felt like a secret the rest of Canada had not discovered. The property backs onto a hillside of ponderosa pine, and in the early mornings the light comes through the kitchen window at an angle that makes the whole room look golden. I never stopped noticing that. Even after my husband passed, even through the years of quiet that followed, I noticed it every single morning. My name is June. I am 64 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed the hardest thing I would ever survive had already happened. I was at a Tim Hortons on the south end of town, the one near the overpass, the Tuesday before everything changed. My nephew had driven me there under the pretense of catching up. He ordered a large double-double and talked about the housing market the way people talk about the weather when they do not want to discuss what is actually happening. His wife sat beside him, scrolling her phone, occasionally looking up to smile at something he said. I had my tea. I was watching a woman at the counter who kept checking the door. She looked to be in her mid-70s, dressed too carefully for a coffee run, the kind of careful that means you are trying to make an impression or brace for something. When my nephew and his wife got up to refill their cups, the woman was beside me before I heard her move. She placed an envelope on the table in front of me, flat and plain, sealed. Her hand trembled slightly as she let go. "Do not open this here," she said quietly. "Read it tonight, alone." I started to ask her something, anything, but she was already walking away, coat buttoned, shoulders back. By the time I stood up, she was through the door and gone into the parking lot, and when I looked through the window, she was nowhere I could see. My nephew returned, stirred his coffee, asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. I put the envelope in my purse and kept my hands folded on the table and finished my tea. The drive home felt longer than it was. My nephew talked about square footage and assessed values. His wife mentioned a condo development near downtown that had an excellent common room and organized activities for residents. I looked out the passenger window at the lake, flat and steel gray under the November clouds, and said very little. They dropped me at the end of my driveway and did not come in. I stood on my porch and watched their car disappear around the bend. The pines were still. The sky had the particular heaviness it gets here before the first real snowfall of the season, like the air is holding something back. Inside, I locked the door. I had started doing that more often in the past few months, though I could not have told you exactly why. I put the envelope on the kitchen table and sat down across from it. The house settled around me. Outside the window, the light faded until the yard was dark, and the hillside was only a shape. I made dinner and ate it standing at the counter. I washed the dish and dried it and put it away. Then I sat back down and I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of notepaper and a small key, old brass, heavier than it looked, the kind that might open a lockbox or a safe deposit drawer. The note was written in careful, deliberate printing, the kind of handwriting you use when you want to be sure it cannot be misread. Tuesday. After 10. Do not use your regular phone. That was all. No signature. No explanation. I turned the key over in my palm. I did not recognize it. I checked the time. It was not yet 8. I had more than 2 hours. I put the key in my cardigan pocket and kept my hand around it. I tried to read. The words would not settle. I turned on the television and watched nothing. At 9:30, I made chamomile tea. I did not drink. At 5 minutes past 10, my phone rang. Not my cell phone. The old landline I had kept mostly out of habit, the one plugged into the wall in the hallway. It rang twice, and I stood there. Then I answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Older, steady. "June," she said. I am sorry to do this over the phone. I am sorry I could not say more this afternoon. I recognized the name she gave me. She had been a colleague of my husband's years ago, before he retired. They had worked together in municipal planning for most of the 90s. I had met her at 2 or 3 office functions. I had not thought about her in years. I want you to listen, she said. What I am going to tell you will be difficult. Please do not interrupt until I have finished. I sat down on the floor of the hallway, which surprised me. I do not usually sit on floors, but my legs made the decision before I did. She told me that 3 months before my husband died, he had come to her. Not as a friend, though they had always been friendly. He had come to her because she had spent the last decade of her career working with the provincial ombudsman's office, and because he trusted her to know what to do with what he had found. What he had found, my husband spent the last 2 years of his life believing our property was being used without our knowledge, not the house itself. The older structure on the back corner of the lot, the one we always call the coach house, a storage building left over from before we bought the place. We had used it for years to keep garden equipment and boxes of things we meant to sort through someday. Sometime after my husband's health started declining, he noticed things. Small things at first. Equipment moved. A padlock on the side door that he had not put there. Tire tracks in the mud that did not belong to either of our vehicles. He did not tell me. He said later in the notes he left her that he did not tell me because he was not certain yet. And then, when he was certain, he did not tell me because he was afraid of what it would mean. The coach house had a crawl space underneath it, one of those old-style foundation gaps common in properties this age. Someone had enlarged it. Carefully, quietly, over what must have been months, and my nephew had a key to the property. He had always had one. We had given it to him years earlier so he could check on the place when we traveled. My nephew had been using our land, letting other people use it. Whatever moved through that crawl space had moved in the dark, in the hours before dawn, and no one in the neighborhood would have noticed because the structure sat behind the house, screened by the pines, invisible from the road. My husband had documented what he could. He had printed records, taken photographs with the old digital camera we kept in the junk drawer. He had written down dates and times and what he had observed. He had given everything to this woman for safekeeping because he did not know who else to trust. And he had asked her to wait, to watch, to contact me only if things moved in a direction that put me at risk. She said the direction had changed. I pressed my hand against the hallway floor and felt the cold of it through my palm. "Why now?" I asked. It was the only thing I could manage. "Because your nephew has filed paperwork," she said. "A capacity assessment request with the Provincial Health Authority. He submitted it 6 days ago. I did not fully understand what that meant until she explained it. In British Columbia, a person can request a formal assessment of a family member's mental capacity if they believe that person is unable to make safe decisions for themselves. If the assessment goes a certain way, a committeeship can be granted. Someone else makes your decisions. Financial decisions. Property decisions." I sat in the hallway for a long time after she stopped speaking. "Your husband left you something," she said finally. "The key in the envelope. There is a lockbox at the coach house behind the loose board on the north interior wall. He asked me to tell you that you will know the right moment to retrieve it. She gave me a number to reach her on. She told me not to discuss this with anyone, not a friend, not a doctor, not anyone whose name my nephew might know. She said she was sorry, again, and meant it in a way I could hear." The line clicked off. I stayed on the floor of the hallway for another few minutes. Then I got up, because I am 64 years old and I have gotten up after hard things before, and I went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and looked at my reflection in the dark window. 38 years on this property, my husband buried in the cemetery 5 minutes away. My nephew had a key. I had given him out of love. I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table until the sky began to lighten in the east, And then I watched the morning come, the way it always does, light through the window, the whole room going golden for a few minutes before it settles into ordinary day. My nephew arrived the next morning without calling first. He had been doing that more often. In the past, he had always texted ahead. Now he simply appeared, as if the question of whether his arrival was convenient no longer applied. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, which had been his uncle's chair for 38 years, and he put his hands flat on the wood and said he needed to talk to me seriously. His wife was not with him this time. That was different. I poured him coffee and sat across from him and waited. He said he was worried about me. He said the property was too much. He said the maintenance costs on a home this size were difficult for anyone on a fixed income, and that since my husband's passing, my spending had become, in his words, hard to track. He mentioned the capacity assessment without calling it that. He said a doctor friend of his had suggested a routine evaluation, just to make sure I had the support I needed going forward. Just to make sure, he said, twice. I looked at his hands on the table. He has his father's hands, broad and square, the same hands I had watched open Christmas presents in this house 20 years ago. I am managing fine, I said. He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. That's what we're trying to protect, Aunt June. We want to make sure it stays that way. After he left, I stood at the back window for a long time. From there, I can see the corner of the coach house between the pines. In 38 years, I had never thought of it as anything other than a nuisance storage problem. I thought about my husband going out there in the evenings those last 2 years, and what it must have cost him to know what he knew and say nothing. I thought about the key in my pocket. I did not go to the coach house that day, or the next. I waited because the woman on the phone had said I would know the right moment, and because I had learned in the months since my husband's death that patience is its own kind of strength, quiet and unglamorous and necessary. What changed my timeline was a letter. It arrived 9 days after my nephew's visit from a law firm in Kelowna I had never heard of. It was formally worded, carefully vague. It referenced the health authority request and noted that should a committeeship be established, the management of any real property in my name would require review. It suggested I might wish to consult a lawyer at my earliest convenience. I read it 3 times. Then I called the number the woman had given me. She answered on the second ring. They have moved to the next step, I said. I know, she said. I heard this morning. June, it is time. I went to the coach house that evening just after dark. I had lived on this land long enough to know where every root is, every soft patch in the ground. I went without a flashlight until I was behind the house and out of sight of the road. The north interior wall smelled of old wood and cold. I ran my hand along the boards until I felt the one that gave slightly. Behind it was a metal lockbox, smaller than I expected, dusty, cold to the touch. The key fit. Inside were 2 USB drives in a Ziploc bag, a printed document of 17 pages held together with a binder clip, and a letter in an envelope with my name on it in my husband's handwriting. I have read that letter so many times now that I have the whole of it memorized. I will not repeat all of it here, but I will tell you this much: he knew. He knew what he had found was serious. He knew that going to the local authorities was not straightforward, not when a family member was involved, and not when he had seen, twice, an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the municipal works-yard with someone he recognized at the wheel. He wrote that he was sorry for keeping it from me. He wrote that he had been afraid, not for himself, which surprised me to read, but for me. He believed that if I knew, I would confront our nephew immediately, because that is the kind of person I am, and that a direct confrontation before there was enough documented evidence would make everything disappear and leave me exposed and unprotected. He was right about that. I would have confronted him. He wrote, near the end, "You're steadier than you know, June. You always have been. Trust that now." I sat on the floor of the coach house with my back against the old shelving and read that letter by the light of my phone until I had it all. Then I put everything in my coat pocket and walked back to the house. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not the one we had used for our wills, a man who knew my nephew socially. I found a firm in Vernon, 40 minutes away, a woman who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. I did not know that elder law was a specialty until I needed it. I drove there myself. I brought the USB drives and the printed document, and I sat across from a woman 12 years younger than me, and I laid everything on her desk. She read quietly. Her expression did not change much, which I found reassuring. I have always been more comfortable around people who do not perform their reactions. When she finished, she looked up. "This is substantial," she said. "Your husband documented dates, vehicle descriptions, and 2 names that appear in the printed records. Combined with the digital files, this gives investigators something real to work with." "I want to stop the capacity assessment," I said. "Can this do that?" She told me that the assessment itself might still proceed. That was a health authority process and it would run on its own track. What this material would do was make the motivations of the person who filed the request relevant. If it could be demonstrated that the request was filed as a mechanism to gain control of property rather than out of genuine concern for welfare, that changed the legal context considerably. She also said I should be prepared for my nephew to escalate when he realized I had retained counsel. "He will," she said simply. "People in this position usually do." She was right. 3 days later, my nephew called and did not bother with the careful wording. He said I was making a mistake. He said I did not understand what I was doing. He said the people he was involved with were not the kind of people who let things go unresolved. I wrote down what he said, word for word, immediately after he hung up. I sent a copy to my lawyer by email. That weekend, a car I did not recognize parked at the end of my road for 4 hours. It did not come closer. It did not leave until after 11 at night. I called the woman from the phone. She had been in contact with the RCMP detachment in Kelowna and had, without identifying me by name, shared enough of the documentation to establish that an investigation was warranted. The federal division had been notified as well. Given the nature of what had been moving through the crawl space and the cross-jurisdictional elements that appeared in my husband's records. She told me to stay inside, to keep my doors locked, and to call her if anything changed. I told her I was fine. She paused on the line. "I know you are," she said. "I am telling you anyway." What happened the following Tuesday, I have replayed many times, not because I enjoy it, but because I think it matters to understand what people will do when they believe they are running out of time. My nephew came with his wife and a man I had never seen, who stood near the front door without being invited in, which told me everything I needed to know about why he was there. My nephew's wife had a folder of papers. She said they were for my benefit. She said the assessment had been fast-tracked and that if I cooperated now, the transition could be handled with dignity. That word, dignity. I asked them to sit down. My nephew looked surprised. His wife looked cautious. They sat. I told them I had been to see a lawyer. I told them I had retained her formally. I told them that the documentation my husband had compiled had been provided to the relevant authorities, that an investigation was underway, and that the capacity assessment had been flagged to the Provincial Public Guardian's office as potentially connected to an ongoing legal matter. My nephew's face did not move for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You do not know what you are getting involved in." "I know exactly what I am involved in," I said. "I have known for 3 weeks." His wife stood up. The man by the door straightened. My nephew looked at me across the table where he had eaten Sunday dinners for years, where his uncle had sat on every Christmas morning, and I watched him make a calculation. I could see it happening. I have raised children. I have watched people decide things. He was deciding whether I was bluffing. I was not bluffing. He stood. They left without another word. The unknown man went last, pulling the door shut carefully, as if he was still trying to make a certain kind of impression. I sat at the table alone. Through the window I could see two vehicles parked at the far end of the road. They had been there since noon, but they were not my nephew's. They were watching him, not me. 40 minutes later, three vehicles came down my driveway. RCMP. Plainclothes officers from the Integrated Criminal Investigation Unit out of Kelowna. They knocked, and I let them in, and one of them sat at my kitchen table and explained, quietly and specifically, what would happen next. My nephew was taken into custody the following morning. His wife was questioned and later released pending charges of her own. The man who had stood at my door was detained at the provincial border. The crawl space under the coach house took 2 days to process. I did not watch. I stayed inside and drank tea and called my daughter in Halifax and talked for an hour about nothing important, just her children and a book she had been reading, and the particular quality of winter light on the ocean, which she says is different from anything else in the world. I did not tell her everything right away. I needed a day to find my footing before I explained what her cousin had done. In the weeks after, my lawyer filed a formal complaint with the health authority regarding the capacity assessment request and the circumstances under which it had been submitted. The assessment was withdrawn. I have the letter confirming that, and I keep it in the same drawer where I keep my husband's last letter to me. I have walked the property differently since then. I notice things I moved through without seeing for years. The way the coach house sits at the edge of the pines, the particular angle of the hillside, the soft ground along the north side that holds moisture long after everything else has dried. My husband walked this land for 2 years carrying something I did not know about, and I think about that often. The weight of what he chose to carry so that I would not have to. I do not know if I would have made the same choice. I like to think I would have told him. But love is complicated, and protection is one of the shapes it takes, even when the shape is wrong. My nephew was charged under the Criminal Code of Canada with fraud, conspiracy, and several counts related to the facilitation of prohibited activity on residential property. His wife faces related charges. The proceedings are ongoing. I have not visited him. I do not know yet whether I will. The woman who handed me the envelope at Tim Hortons came to see me once, about 2 months after everything had settled. She had known my husband since before I did. She sat at my kitchen table and had tea and told me he had talked about me more than I probably knew. She said he was proud of me in the specific way that people are proud of someone they believe in, not just love. I cried, which I have been doing more easily since this all happened. I think that is all right. I still live in the same house. The light still comes through the kitchen window in the mornings and makes the room golden for a few minutes before it changes. The coach house is empty now. I have been thinking about what to do with it. Something useful. Something that earns it a different kind of memory. I do not think of myself as a brave person. I have never been dramatic about hard things. What I know is that when it came down to it, I trusted what my husband had trusted me with. I followed what he left. I stood in the places he pointed me toward, and I did not move when it would have been easier to move. At 64, you know something about staying. You have stayed through illness and loss and the particular loneliness of a house that used to be louder than it is. You have learned that staying is not the same as being stuck. Sometimes it is the most defiant thing you can do. The land is still mine, and the truth my husband buried for safekeeping is buried no longer. What I learned through all of this is something I wish I had understood sooner. The people who claim to be protecting you are not always the ones who are. Sometimes protection is quiet and careful and leaves you a key inside a plain envelope. And sometimes the person who loved you most is the one who prepared you for the moment they knew they could not be there for. Not because they gave up, but because they trusted you more than they trusted their own survival. That is not a small thing. That is everything. I have thought about cause and effect a great deal since all of this happened. Not in any grand or philosophical way, just the quiet, practical way you do when you are sitting in your kitchen watching morning light come through a window and realizing that every single thing that saved you was set in motion by choices made long before you knew you needed saving. My husband made choices. He saw something wrong, and instead of looking away, he documented it. He reached out to someone he trusted. He prepared quietly, carefully, in the way that people prepare when they love someone more than they fear what is coming. Those choices, made in the last 2 years of his life, were what kept me standing when my nephew sat across from me in Gordon's chair and said the word dignity, as if he had any claim to it. That is how cause and effect actually works, I think. Not as punishment or reward handed down by some outside force, but as the accumulated weight of what people choose to do when no one is watching and nothing is easy. My nephew chose convenience over conscience for long enough that he eventually chose to try to take everything from me. Gordon chose honesty over comfort and left me a key inside a plain envelope. Both of those choices had consequences. Both arrived at my kitchen table on the same cold November morning. What I know about moral intelligence, and I do not use that phrase lightly, is that it is not about following rules. It is about knowing the difference between what is expedient and what is right, and choosing right even when expedient would cost you nothing in the short term. My nephew was not a cruel person when he was young. I watched him grow up. Something in him learned over time to rationalize the distance between those two things until the distance disappeared entirely. That is how people end up where he ended up. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small surrenders of their own judgment. I did not save myself through cleverness. I want to be honest about that. I followed what my husband left. I trusted a woman I had met twice at office parties 20 years ago because she had earned that trust in a way I only understood in retrospect. I found a lawyer 40 minutes away and sat down and told the truth. Those are not heroic acts. They are the acts of a person who decided that her own assessment of reality was worth defending. That is the thing about staying steady under pressure. It is not a feeling, it is a decision you make again and again, sometimes every few minutes, when the easier thing would be to doubt yourself. My nephew was counting on me to doubt myself. He had been building the conditions for that doubt for months before I ever noticed. When I stopped cooperating with his version of my own incompetence, everything else followed. I am 64 years old. I live alone in a house I have kept for 38 years. The land is mine. The mornings are mine. The grief is mine. And so is the gratitude and the particular clarity that comes from having been tested and finding out you did not fail. What I would want anyone to take from this, anyone who is older and being managed, or younger and watching someone they love being managed, is that your own steadiness is real. It is earned by every hard thing you have already been through, and it does not leave you just because someone tells you it has. Trust what you know. Do the next right thing. The rest has a way of following.